If you've ever found yourself knocked down by life and you just wanted to stay down, well, I'm glad you're here for this conversation today. Hi, I'm Rob, and it's great to be able to catch up with you for a few moments here today. Let me remind you of our interactive teaching videos that are available for kids and families. A simple search for Cabin Kids on Facebook will take you right to our page and that resource. And as you may know, our focus here in this video will also spring from the same themes and scriptures that we're focusing on in our family videos that we just mentioned. Our goal is to equip people of all ages to have faith conversations that can be helpful for following Jesus together. Now, this month we've been exploring how things happen in life where we feel like the wind can get knocked out of us. It can sometimes seem like we need regular reminders that God is strong and He's faithful and that He's always at work in our lives. Jesus showed us how to face life with resilience. Because of Jesus, we can trust God no matter what, and things may knock us down, but they don't have to knock us out. So let's jump into what we can discover about all of that today. There's all kinds of times in our lives when things get uncertain. It could have something to do with a sick or an aging family member. Could be a tough situation that you're running into at work, or it could be something at home. It could be that you've just heard from the doctor and the prognosis is grim. We've all had things that have knocked us down. They may seem large or small now as we look back at them, but ultimately we come into them and we're kind of thrown in and we have to engage. And we find ourselves asking, how do we deal with this? What do we do? Oftentimes we put the weight of our confidence in something, and in our world today we often hear a statement like this. It says, just trust yourself, you'll bounce back. And so we put our confidence in our strength and our competence, our desires or our positivity, and we make statements like, I'm good, I'm going to make it, I'll bounce back, I've done it before. I recall where I was the day I got the call that my dad had gone into hospital. And little did I know that that particular call would start a whole chain of events that really led to his long-term care and dealing with so many different aspects of his aging and eventually his passing. That journey of several months in the hospital and getting shifted all around in that particular location, the several years that followed and the care that was a part of that, oftentimes when you get into it, you kind of tell yourself, well, okay, we're going to make it, we'll just keep going and just keep going and just keep going. But then you get pulled in multiple directions, and in my case, it was the care for my parents. I mean, that could have been a full-time job of doctor's appointments and all of the different dynamics that are a part of taking care of aging family members. But at the same time, I had a family with young kids at home. And that could have been a full-time job all by itself too, dealing with sports and all of the different dynamics of family at home and young kids. But yet, I also had a full-time job. I had work that I needed to be doing. And so, as I'm thinking about keeping on going, what happens when I get to the end of myself? We've all run into those kind of places where it's hard or it's painful, and sometimes we run into them in a long season of either discouragement or difficulty, and we wonder whether this will ever be different. And there are times when it stays difficult over a long period of time. Sometimes it even degrades and gets worse. It can be helpful to often hear stories of how other people made it through. A friend who had some difficulty and what they did as they walked through life with aging family members or sick parents. How someone has navigated their dysfunctional family, or how a person may have taken a long road through a difficult illness. That's encouraging, and it's a look back so that we can look ahead. And when we look to the Bible, we see stories of how so many other people made it because of their trust in God. And it made it possible to deal with difficulties they faced that sometimes we're not even sure how they would have made it. And in some cases, they never saw what they were looking for, even in their own lifetime. It was like we can look back in order to look ahead. Now, as we jump in today into the scripture in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to find that the author is doing just that with a group of people who had a lot of things kind of knocking them down, especially related to their faith. There was open hostility, and people were getting put in prison. Physical abuse, in some cases, even execution, were part of the landscape for those who were choosing to follow Jesus and to live as his apprentice. And so the author of Hebrews is encouraging them to hang in there, not because of who they are, but because of who God is and how he has worked in the past. And so as a result, we can hang in there too. Now, he makes a list of a bunch of different situations and people who had all kinds of different things that had knocked them down. A lot of things that when we read through them, we would think, well, that's kind of unfair. Let's check this out together in Hebrews chapter 11, reading at verse 1. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. By faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. So the author really changes the narrative here. You can be sincere in your faith, but what you're placing your faith in is what he says is more important than just having some kind of faith. And that's a game changer that really leads to what happens next. It was by faith that Abel brought a more acceptable offering to God than Cain did. Abel's offering gave evidence that he was a righteous man, and God showed his approval of his gifts. Although Abel is long passed away, he still speaks to us by his example of faith. It was by faith that Enoch was taken up to heaven without dying. He disappeared because God took him. For before he was taken up, he was known as a person who pleased God. And it's impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. It was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God, who warned him about things that had never happened before. And by his faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world, and he received the righteousness that comes by faith. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and to go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith, for he was a foreigner living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and way too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. And so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead, a nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there's no way to count them. All these people died, still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they had come from, they would have gone back. But they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That's why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again, and in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. It was by faith that Isaac was promised blessings for the future to his sons, Jacob and Esau. It was by faith that Jacob, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. It was by faith that Moses, his parents, hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child and that they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. It was by faith Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin, though he thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. It was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and to sprinkle blood on the doorposts so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons. It was by faith that the people of Israel went right through the Red Sea as though they were on dry ground, and when the Egyptians tried to follow, they were all drowned. It was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the walls came crashing down. It was by faith that Rahab the prostitute was not destroyed with the people in her city who refused to obey God, for she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. How much more do I need to say, he writes. It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weaknesses were turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back again from the dead. Others were tortured, however, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prison. Some died by stoning. Some were sawed in half. Others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith in God. Yet none of them received all of what God had promised, for God had something better in mind for us so that they would not reach perfection without us. Now the author, in a very, very healthy way, is saying, these people inspire me to trust God. He's saying to them and to us, not because of who we are, but because of who God is. They made it, and so can you and I. The thing they have in common is that it's God in whom they put their faith. And we can have that same kind of faith in the midst of uncertainty. When things go good or when they go poorly, when things are uncertain, well, we can continue to trust who God is. It's when we look back at God's faithfulness, it helps us to look ahead. Many of you will likely remember or even know the story of Derek Redmond, the 400-meter Olympic runner who qualified to represent Great Britain in Barcelona in 1992. He had won the gold the previous year at the World Championships and qualified for the team, but in the Olympic competition, with just one lap to go, a nightmare scenario unfolded where his hamstring tore in the middle of the race, and he was flattened to the mat with the pain. And in a now famous video that's been played millions and millions of times, his dad emerged from the stands and came down and helped him back up, and he put his weight on his dad and was able to finish the race. It's an inspiring, iconic moment that you've probably witnessed. It's one of the top 10 Olympic moments of all times. Now, the author of Hebrews understood that there are some days that are harder than others, and maybe there's days where you just feel like, I just want to stay flat on the mat. But as we mentioned, life for the people who first read the book of Hebrews was just like the challenges that sometimes we find ourselves in. For some who followed Jesus, they were trying to sort out, in their case, if it was still worth it to deal with all that was going on. They were flat on the mat. Did they want to keep going? They couldn't always see the larger story because all they could see was what was happening to them right now. Through faith in God, they not only endured, but we would say that many of them thrived in some of the difficult circumstances they faced. And still, they trust God no matter what. With God's help, these heroes of the faith that this author of Hebrews writes down, they got back up when life knocked them down. And this is the message for us today as we think about getting slapped down to the mat in painful situations. God worked in them not because their faith was especially unique or because they were especially unique. We could look back on how God had worked and look ahead to continue to trust His faithfulness, because faith just means that we trust God and believe that God is always good. And as we believe that, we may not understand all of what's happening in our lives right now, but we can continue on in Him. Author and musician Sheila Walsh said it this way: "In uncertain times, I know 100% that I can stake my life on the unshakable, unchanging promises of God." But you know what? There's a conflict that kind of rises in all of us. It's the conflict that rises of fear and sometimes control. Fear about the way it will work out, and we want to control sometimes the way everything will play out so that it's to our liking. There's lots of places where, because of fear and control, well, we find ourselves wrestling back and trying to get to a place where things will work out in our own minds if we just do this and this and this. Soon we realize, in the middle of that we're at the end of ourselves. By faith, all these people we heard about in the book of Hebrews, they released fear and control. And a pro tip for you here: the earlier in any journey that we do this, the better. If we wait till the last possible minute to trust God, well, then we've expended a lot of energy and time where we could have been resting in God's resources instead of our own, and shifting the weight from, I can make it if I just work harder, if I just do this better, to regardless of how it looks, I know God will take me through it. And by faith, we shift where we put our weight, a lot like Derek did in that iconic Olympic moment. From our strength to God's power. From our competence to God's plan. From our desires to God's purpose. From our positivity to God's possibility. That's the simplicity of faith that sometimes causes people to stumble and to think, well, that's kind of crazy, really. But when you put your weight on Jesus, He will help you finish the race. Because ultimately, faith is looking at the big picture of God's work throughout history and trusting that God will continue to work out things in our story, and all of the parts, even the hardest parts, are something that He is at work in. Now, you know what? It could be pretty easy for you to look at this list of people in Hebrews and say, well, you know what? I'm not like those people. I mean, and I'm not in the situations they're in. They're in the Bible, after all. I mean, their story is widely known. They're probably not like me. Part of you would be right. You may be different than they are. But watch what the author of Hebrews says just a chapter or so over that addresses what we may have struggled with. In Hebrews chapter 13, verses 7 and 8, it says this, "Remember your leaders who taught you the word of God. Think of all the good that has come from their lives, and follow their example of faith." Now watch this. This is the important part in verse 8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now nowhere does it say, do the things that they did. Be like them. Instead, it says, follow their example. In one translation, it actually uses the word imitate their faith. Now, we may be different, but God is the same. Because God is the same, His work in them was not because of how much they were sincere in their faith. It was never about us or our faith or how strong our faith was. It's in whom we place our faith and where we put our weight, in the same Jesus who was raised from the dead, in the same Jesus who lives in us by His Holy Spirit. And it's not just reserved for uncertain times, but uncertainty definitely helps us to realize that we need to put our weight in God. So, God brings a help so that we can get back up. And sometimes He brings people along in the process to help with that. Sometimes He sends you and me to be a part of that journey together. But God is the one who is bringing the help in uncertainty so that we can get back up again, so that we can make it through as a result of who He is. Because we've all had tough situations that arise in our lives, and sometimes the toughest moments are how we will trust God when life gets uncertain. Trusting God when we don't have all the answers. Trusting Him when we feel vulnerable. When we're face to face with our own lack of power to be able to deal with what's in front of us. As we release control to Him. Hebrews shares that we can be thankful to God for the way that He works, for the people He brings, for the resources He provides, for the way that He works with people, and that He's the same today as He was with any of the people we read about in the book of Hebrews, or even the folks who were reading it at the time. He's faithful to help us get back up, and let us put our weight on Him to finish the race. Now, each of these Old Testament stories that we have kind of alluded to here in the book of Hebrews, they required faith in God. They confidently faced obstacles and even bounced back from hard times because they trusted God was in control of the situation that they faced. Think about this. When we choose to trust God, we actually become part of His continuing story of faithfulness alongside these amazing men and women in the Bible. And if we think about all that God has done in their lives, it reminds us that God is the same today and can do amazing things in our lives too, as we put our weight in Him. Because of who God is, they made it, and so can we. And as we trust Him to help us get back up in uncertain times, maybe what we can be helped by today is to look back at His faithfulness as we consider looking ahead to what God is doing in our own lives too. Let's take some time to pray together. Jesus, we come to You and we're thankful for the truth of Your word that reminds us that You are the same yesterday, today, and forever. And You don't ask us to be Abraham or in order to receive Your blessing or to even be able to walk through the days that we face to act more like Joseph. That's not what anything encourages us to do here. It's to recognize that the faith that was present there is the faith that you long for us to continue to have in you. You haven't changed. You are reliable. And so we look to you and to your faithfulness for all the situations we face, whether things are going great in our lives or whether things are very uncertain, and whether we're kind of coming into some times that we aren't really sure just how things are going to work out. And so God, today, I thank you for the way that you help us to get up off the mat and to allow us to put our weight on you in the midst of difficult times. Thank you for the way that you've consistently done that throughout history. And as we look back, it encourages us as we look ahead to know that we can trust you and we can make it through too. We love you and we thank you. In your name I pray. Amen. Well, thanks again for taking a few minutes to share this time together today. And before you go, if you don't mind taking just a moment to like, comment, or share this video, that's always an encouragement for us when you do. And if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, or maybe even liked or follow us on Facebook, then feel free to do that at the end of this video. We also have a link that's available in the description section of this video that takes you to our website, where there are podcast extras. And those extras include some worship at home resources, as well as some questions that can be helpful as you're journaling or maybe discussing what God is teaching you with a friend, and some other links to our church as well. I encourage you to check all of those out and follow through on those in just a moment. And as always, we're praying for you. We trust you're praying for us too. We'll look forward to seeing you all again soon.